This evening our topic is language and literature, and it's an important topic because really any education that we get almost all of it through language. And the fundamental point about building culture is being able to access the thoughts of somebody besides the people in the room. Because if you can't write, especially if you can't read, then you only have access to the information from the smartest people around you, and if one of them dies, it's just an absolute loss of information. But once you're able to read, you can access all kinds of stuff. It's just very, very important. And of course, writing is important. That's a way of expressing yourself. But let me begin with talking about the first elements of language, not necessarily the first one babies have, but words. The great writers, and I'm thinking especially of Emily Dickinson because I remember her name, but there are several of them. Their favorite book, I mean, I'm sure that they loved the Bible, and I'm sure they loved Shakespeare. They loved the dictionary. Emily Dickinson felt that the dictionary was her friend. It opened up all kinds of worlds to her. And you know, when you only use a dictionary because you want to look up a word, and especially if the only reason you use the dictionary is because mom tells you to look up a word, it's not fun. The dictionary is full of information. When you look up a word, you as moms, or when you encourage your children to look something up and work with them, besides just what the word means, you also can find out what language it's from and what the history of the word is. And when you find out those things, there's things in there that are really about human nature. One of the books that I loved when I was growing up was C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Studies in Words. And one of the things that he said was that the word for heavy in Greek, in Latin, and in Anglo-Saxon had moved from heavy weight to heavy in the heart. So we talk about a grave matter, and grave is the same root as gravity. And we talk about being heavy-hearted, and that's one where we still have both meanings going. But the word sad also was originally a word for heavy. And now that one has completely gone over. It doesn't mean physically heavy at all. But this feeling that, you know, that when things are painful, they weigh us down, is universal. And that's an important thing to know in itself, because, you know, we have these people now, deconstructionists, who are kind of busy saying that everybody's different, everybody has a different meaning for every word, we can't really talk to each other because we all have our private meanings for words. And it is true that each person has a slightly different experience with each word. And so there are differences, and they're part of the richness of life. Nevertheless, there's such a thing as human nature, and you see it in the words. You actually see it in the history of words. You say, wow, this person so long ago was experiencing sorrow the same way that I do. And it's built right into the language to speak to me from long ago and say, we're all in this together. So that's very exciting. Besides a dictionary, I encourage you to get a book like, it's one of my favorite books. This book is it's called Choose the Right Word. I don't like the thesaurus anymore. And the reason is, what happens when children have a thesaurus is that they start, you know, some teacher tells them, well, you know, you should use more interesting words. So they pull out the thesaurus, throw in an interesting word, and it isn't really the right word. It doesn't really express what they're saying. And the idea that all these different words are interchangeable sort of creeps into their writing. And that's really, it's just anti-educational. When you choose the right word, what this book does is, like a thesaurus, it'll take you to a word, and it will give you, in the margin, it has all of the synonyms. But in the text, now I have this marked for a particular word, but in the text what it will do is it will take all of the synonyms and it will say, this word is used for, what was it? Anyway, this is used in a formal setting. this word means something sort of noble. This word means something bright and sparkly. And it's all like words about nobility, words about bravery, words about courage. Each one of them has a different place in the language. And the truth is, if two words really do have the same meaning, one of them is about to leave the language. A language will not hold two words that genuinely have the same meaning. And so English has, actually I don't know how many words it has now. 20 years ago when I first read about it, English had 600,000 words. And the next biggest language was French with 250,000. English is an enormous language. It has tons of words. And part of the reason that happened is that the English sailors went all around the world and brought the words back from everywhere that they went. And they were the biggest sailors because it's an island country. And nobody else did it the same way. And then there was this whole episode of Napoleon deciding that French was going to be a pure language and they weren't going to let any of these horrible words in from other languages because that just polluted the whole thing. Well, fine, but that kept French in the Dark Ages while English marched forward. There's another reason why English is so absorbent of words, kind of an interesting reason. English is not particularly an inflected language. That is to say, when we say two pretty girls, the French would say twos, pretties, girls. And they put all those extra endings on. What this does is it makes it more difficult to add a new word to the language. Because when you are adding an S onto the end of a word, you know, and it ends in a Z, then you got to figure out whether you're going to keep the Z or, you know, all those kinds of things. So the languages that are inflected find it more difficult to absorb new words. And then you have Chinese. Chinese, like English, is completely uninflected, but it's written with characters. It's really hard to add new words to a language like that. One of the reasons why the Chinese didn't progress in literacy as fast as other countries is because even once they had printing, which they had from an early time, they didn't have an alphabet, and that just makes word absorption very, very, very difficult because every single word has to be taught. And how are you going to write a dictionary in Chinese? You know, which is going to be the first word in the dictionary? You see what the problem is. So English is very special. It's very exciting, and even discussions about, oh, we should reform spelling in the English language. Well, actually, we did reform a whole bunch of it. Noah Webster did, and you'll notice it when you're reading C.S. Lewis that he spells honor H-O-N-O-U-R, and we spell it H-O-N-O-R. So there's some reforms that have taken place, but every time you reform a language, there's two things that you face. One is that you've cut off the past, and so the history is no longer sitting right there in the word. The second thing, of course, is that there are dialects all over, even all over this country, let alone this country plus England plus Australia. And when you reform the language, whose dialect is going to govern what reforms you do? So anyway, enjoy words, teach your children to enjoy words, and understand that that love of words is the beginning of the love of language. So now let's go on to something a little bit longer. And there are a couple of things. One is that we have sentences, and in the sentence what we have is words put into relationships with each other. That's the way to think about it. And when we put words in relationship to each other, the essential thing is to build the sentence in such a way that people always know what the relationship is between all the different parts of the sentence. That's actually why sentence diagramming is important. It helps you to learn Latin, but the real thing is that when you make a long sentence, you start to get to where people aren't quite sure whether the last word in the sentence modifies the one right before it, or the one 2 steps in, or something like that. And that awkwardness makes it not satisfying to read. The reason why people don't like to read legal papers is because the sentences are long, and halfway through the sentence they get lost, and they don't know where they are, and they don't know how to find where they are, and so it isn't fun anymore. It isn't informative anymore. But the same problem applies to philosophy, to theology, and the same problem applies to really good poetry. A lot of poetry has word orders that have been shifted. You know, in Latin, because it's inflected, it's easy to find words that all have the same ending. In English, which isn't inflected, it's difficult to find words with the same ending, and if you find one, a lot of times you turn the whole sentence around so it can go at the end of the line and give you your rhyme, you know? And the result is that somebody who isn't really thinking about syntax, who has never thought about syntax, easily gets lost. And that is the main reason why people don't like poetry. They're lost, they don't know what it means, they figure if he wants to say something, why doesn't he just say it straight out? And the answer is because there's a music in the language. Let me tell you something interesting about the music. You probably know this, but anyway. Before children actually begin to speak, there's a little period where they make hummy sounds that sound like a person talking. And those hummy sounds are them feeling the music of the English language. And if you hear a French baby, you'll hear that their hummies are different from English hummies. They are actually picking up the music. And I had this experience visiting Brazil 6 years ago or so, and I was listening to all of this Portuguese around me all the time, like that. And one day, all of a sudden, it just came out of me, complete nonsense syllables, but I could feel myself they were Portuguese nonsense syllables instead of English nonsense syllables. And right away, Martha Braga looked up and she said, Mary is speaking Portuguese. But speaking it like a 2-month-old baby. So it doesn't go very far. But the music of the language is a very real thing. And we see that in all of our speech, but we see it especially in poetry. And when we say that something is a great piece of literature, one of the things that we see in a great piece of literature is we just like how the words sound. They just roll off, you know? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and you're sort of on a roll. When I read C.S. Lewis, well, not C.S. Lewis, when I read Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Tom Bombadil often says poetry. And you can see it and you can check it out. It's all iambic pentameter. Here's what's interesting. The iambic pentameter is laid out like a poem. But every single thing that Tom Bombadil says is still in iambic pentameter. You can analyze the whole deal. It's very, very funny. And it just gives him his musical character. It's like having an instrument that represents a particular character in a musical piece. It's really fun. So the next thing is to enjoy the music of the language, and in order to help your children enjoy it, actually they should write poetry. I thought at first that maybe some people don't like to write it. Well, now I'm at the point of thinking, maybe some people don't like it, but almost everybody likes poetry if it's just not threatening. Like, oh my gosh, here I am. I've never written a poem before. I'm 14 years old and I'm supposed to come up with a sonnet by tomorrow morning. No, that isn't really fun. But the thing that's fun is just to write a quatrain. And especially, I've done this in several different classes. It was something that was suggested by G.K. Chesterton and his friends, William Bentley Clarihew, in fact, to make up a verse about anybody in history, where the first line has the person's name at the end of the line, and the second line rhymes with it, but now you're doing his biography. And then the third and fourth lines rhyme with each other, but they don't scan. One of them has kind of the wrong number of syllables, you know, like that limerick. There was a young man in Japan whose limericks never would scan. When they asked him the cause, his reply to them was, because I always try to put as many words in the last line as I possibly can. So you can, a cleric, you can have extra words in the last line, or fewer words, but kids just get a kick out of it. They get a kick out of it when it does scan, they get a kick out when it doesn't, and it's so easy that it's a way of having children play with their language. They need to play with it. So, words, sentences, verses, and now we can talk, I think I've talked a little bit already about rationality involving learning to reason and then having fields of knowledge. So what's next in literature is larger bodies either of knowledge or of story. The interesting thing is, even when it's scientific, it doesn't really have to be horrible. A lot of it is, but it doesn't really have to be. There's for example, there's a book called From Raindrops to Volcanoes. And the author just, you know, tries to figure out everything he can about raindrops. He is a scientist, but he doesn't have a lot of equipment. This book is 50 years old. So he tries to figure out how big raindrops are. How can I measure the size of a raindrop? And what he finally does is he takes a silk stocking and he puts flour on it and spreads it over a catching place, a plate of some kind. And then he catches the raindrops and sees how big of a wet space they make. Well, what's funny is to have a serious scientist working this thing out and finding out all kinds of things about the difference between big raindrops and little raindrops, and some rain is made from warm rain and some rain is cold rain, and it all has different physics, and really interesting. And he goes step by step through all these different interesting things until in the end he's talking about the Surtsey volcano in Iceland, which has a tremendous explosion, and the commotion in the sea causes seawater to be thrown up, and some of it dries out, and then you have salt up in the air, and some of it doesn't dry out and you have water up in the air, but all this stuff is moving around each other, and so then you have lightning, and it's a fascinating book. It's a fascinating book, and it shows you the actual mind of a scientist, not the mind of a bookkeeper reporting a bunch of things that he carefully measured, and you know, it's not a bookkeeper book. It's a science book. It's how do people think. Another one is this one's pretty well known now. Fabre's book about insects. You just see a man saying, "Oh, well, how does that work? How can I figure out how that works?" And you go along with him in his exploration. People really need to see that, and to see that a scientist can write a beautiful piece of work. So that's at the informative end. Now, you know, if I said I was going to talk about literature, you probably thought I was going to talk about the story side of literature. So we'll give at least a few minutes to that. First of all, I talked last month about psychology, and I probably said this then, but I'll say it again. Psychology as a distinct scientific discipline with counting up how many people cough on Monday and how many cough on Tuesday and making a big chart about it, dates from about the middle of the 19th century. The first big famous book is 1876. And there was a lab, and so psychology did not begin in the 19th century. Psychology began the first time anybody talked about, why do you make the decisions that you make? Okay? So Shakespeare, great psychologist. There's Hamlet saying, I really don't, this is not a good king, it's not a good situation, I wish I were dead. You know, that's really what to be or not to be is all about. And other people all through history, and particularly in England then, have said, this is a mess. Do I really have to deal with it? Is there some way that I could just not be here and not have to deal with it? And that's really what Shakespeare is reflecting on. So when you choose a piece of literature, what you're doing, first of all, is you are teaching psychology. You are saying, think about how people live together, think about how they make decisions, think about what kinds of things are important to them. And so the plot of the story is very important for that reason. You know, when you say, oh, well, you know, we should really talk about psychology, tell me about your mother. Tell me about your best friend that you're mad at right now. I promise I won't tell anybody what you say. Do you see how dangerous that is? The word always gets out eventually that somebody was talking about somebody. But if you just talk about Hamlet, or if you just talk about Frodo, or if you just talk about Antigone, then you're talking about what the decision is, about what the limits of loyalty are, what the meaning of life is. And you will, in the course of reading about Antigone and reading about Hamlet, you will suddenly realize, oh, that's what my sister was doing. Or, oh, I know what Mom was working on. And so you get the insight that you need for the relationships in your life. But you're able to discuss it very freely with the people around you and without pointing fingers. And that's actually helpful. Maybe sometime off in the confessional you can talk specifically about your problems. But especially in a classroom, oh my goodness, how dangerous that is. Or even in a group of women gathered, how harmful is it to talk about somebody who's not there, and how painful it is to talk about somebody who's there. Whereas if you talk about a piece of literature, you can process all the questions that you might have. In that context, it's probably worth taking a minute to ask ourselves, what makes a literary piece a Christian piece? For some people, the answer is, well, if it's about a biblical character, or if it's a life of a saint, then it's Christian literature. And that's a safe approach. I'd have to say there's a few things in the Bible that I wouldn't necessarily want to put into just any old literature class as an example of Christian or Jewish thought. It just depends on how you presented it. But when you take something like The Lord of the Rings, or something like Hamlet, you're looking at a story where there isn't really a reference to God or salvation. I guess there's a bit of reference to salvation in Hamlet, but what makes that kind of a story Christian is that fundamentally there is a sense of an overriding providence. That's the thing that's Christian. And that's the image that you're giving to a child or to a reader, is just a picture of providence. Not necessarily the word providence, not necessarily the name of God, maybe not. But the picture in Hamlet, of course it's a Shakespearean tragedy, everybody's dead at the end. But actually, not quite everybody. Denmark has a new king and he's good, and Horatio's around to tell the story, and Hamlet has made it up with Laertes, and a lot of things are resolved, and the bad king is dead, and the good queen, and the floppy queen has repented. So there's all these pieces where you see a providence, and you see that also in, of course, in Lord of the Rings. You know, it's a very funny thing. The first time I saw Lord of the Rings in a theater, it came to the part where the ring was thrown into Mount Doom, and all the people in the theater who hadn't read the book got up to go because the story's over. He threw the ring in the crack of doom. Well, no, it's not really over. So then they get to Gondor and they have the big party, and Aragorn gets crowned, and then they all got up to go again. Guys, you didn't read the book, sit down. It goes on for kind of a long time. Then finally Frodo sails off into the sunset. Well, then they get up and they go, no, we're not done yet. And finally Stan comes back to Rosie and says, I'm home. And then it's over. So that expectation, that sense of providence, is so enormous in what Tolkien has done. And that's what it means to have a Christian plot. It doesn't mean, I mean, saints are just one example, one way of doing it. It's very important to do it other ways, especially if you're in a public school setting. So plot is an important element of stories. Another thing that's important, I mean, the basic thing is character. And I just learned a new phrase for describing horrible characters. The new phrase is destiny fallacy. Probably everybody else has already heard that, but it was new to me. Destiny fallacy is what you have when an author has been developing a character, and he has also been developing a story, and he has an idea of his storyline, and all of a sudden he just makes the character do something so he can get his storyline done. And it doesn't really come out of the character. And what happens is you read it and you go, what? And then you say, well, that's not really a great book. I don't necessarily know what's wrong with it, but it isn't great. Here's what isn't great. The author has to let his characters do what is within them. And it's really an image of how God has made us. You know, he's God, he can do anything. But he's given us our freedom so that we can actually be ourselves. And in an analogous way, a good author builds his characters, and the decisions that they make come out of who they actually are. And if it's not fitting his story, he's got to deal with that some way. But he can't just push his characters into the destiny that he feels like. That's what makes a bad story. And that's an interesting point, because one of the things that's running around the internet these days is this dreadful, dreadful example from the Common Core curriculum. It's just a sample. It's not, we don't know what's actually on there, but this is the kind of thing that's on there. And what happens is, this little boy wakes up, and it's late, and he runs down the hallway and tells his mom, I think we're late. That's a very generous thing for a little boy to say. Mom, why didn't you wake me up? No, he goes, Mom, I think we overslept. Then he runs back and he brushes his hair and he runs down to the kitchen, he grabs his apple, grabs his school books, runs out the door, and we haven't heard a word from his mom. She hasn't come out in the hallway, she didn't fry him an egg, she didn't help him get his backpack on, nothing. And then he goes out and the bus comes out and it pulls away just as he comes out the sidewalk, and then you're supposed to finish the story. Okay. Here's the deal. There are so many destiny fallacies in this story already that there is no honest way to finish the story. In other words, who is the mom? The mom is living in a house so big that when his alarm rings, he goes down the hall to her room. So she's a single mom with one child, she lives in a house, and she isn't professional enough to get up on time. I don't think so. You know what I'm saying? No. Then he comes out, and he's a nice little boy. He hasn't criticized his mom, he hasn't complained, he hasn't done anything. And he comes out, and the bus pulls away, and the little children on the bus don't yell at the bus driver, stop, 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 wait for Tommy. They just drive off. No. That isn't the way it works. When a child is really, really sweet like that, somebody on the bus stops the driver. That's just the way it is. So you have this whole stack up of things that are wrong, and it's a depressing story. Okay, now I'm going to get mad, so it's just, when children are taking tests, they need to use their whole mind. When children are frightened, they don't use their whole mind. They only use the right brain. That's children, people. That's just the way it works. That's the way God made us. The jaguar jumps in the window. You don't have a debating society. You move. If you frighten a child during a test, what you've done is turned off half of his brain at the moment that you're testing him. And that is wicked. It's just wicked. And you're asking him to finish a story where you have so many destiny fallacies in it that there's really nothing to finish. It's just a piece of trash. So when we talk about Common Core being horrible, instead of saying, I think it's horrible, we can say, well, your samples are full of destiny fallacy and they're depression. And that's just not fair. So plot, character. In a way, we've talked about thought because we've talked about the overarching providence that's in the story, the overarching, there's also an overarching joy. That doesn't mean nothing ever goes wrong. I actually don't think that Pollyanna, for example, is a particularly Christian story because she's such a fake. She makes up possible positive interpretations of things, but realistically, her interpretations are, they're not really what's happening. They do end up putting a little bit of pressure on people to live their lives at a higher level. And it is true that holiness does sometimes push people to rise above themselves a little bit. So there are elements of truth in it. But writing a Christian story doesn't mean writing a Pollyanna story. It can have bucket loads of sorrow. But underneath, there's that sense that all will be well. All will truly be well. And that's what's essential. And if that thought is not present in a story, then you need to ask, why is somebody putting a negative thought? Why is the whole story a negative thought? Of course the answer is because the author has negative thoughts. And there are many philosophers of the 20th century with negative thoughts. There's a very interesting book out now called Faith of the Fatherless. And psychiatrist Paul Vitz has written a bunch of biographies of the famous atheists of really of the last 400 years, and shown that these were men, many of them, a very large number of them, were men who lost their fathers early on, or whose fathers were cruel. In other words, men who really didn't have fathers. And then they turned around and rejected God the Father, and then they had no sense of providence. And then, just to make the book kind of complete, he goes to some of the famous theists, for example, Pascal, and he describes these men's relationships with their fathers, and it's just sweet. Pascal's father taking him on his knee, reading to him. It's just a really beautiful, beautiful picture of a father. And then you come out with a theist. So the thought in the story is also important. The setting is interesting. When you look at the setting, one thing to notice is what kinds of exchanges take place in what kinds of settings. Because even in our own lives, we know that the kinds of conversation that you have when you're out on a mountain are not necessarily the same kinds of conversations that you would have if you're in a coffee shop, and especially they're not the same kind of conversations that you would have in a chaotic room of a house that nobody's even trying to clean. So you have, when you read Jane Austen, she has a story about Fanny Price. It's called Mansfield Park, and you have Fanny Price coming from a very poor background and a pretty coarse background. So you have one kind of setting there, and then you have a different kind of setting in the house, and then you have, it's just interesting to see how the setting contributes to the conversation. But in the end, what we're really looking for is there's a moment when you put the book down, and at that moment, are you feeling like the light is on? Or are you feeling like, okay, I'm going to just kick the next person I meet? I remember one time reading C.S. Lewis. I was reading one of the Chronicles of Narnia, and Mom called me to help out with something or other, whatever it was. And I just remember how peaceful I was about doing what she wanted. I was just in this frame of serenity from reading that book. So that even though I never liked to be interrupted, it was okay, because it was like part of that book to just be where you are and do what you should do. So those are some of the things to think about with literature. And then there's one more that isn't talked about very much, but it's extremely important. a good piece of literature is always marked by the fact that it can be read on at least 4 levels. Somebody told me that the 4 levels were in Dante's Vita Nuovo, and I was never able to find them there, but anyway, I can still tell you what they are. And we'll just use Jack and the Beanstalk because that's a quick, easy one to lay it out with. You have the literal level, there's just a story. Here's Jack, he's got the beans, he's got the magic beanstalk and stuff. The second level is there are people in the world who have difficulties and who start addressing their difficulties in unexpected ways, and then they get unexpected help and blessings, and then things smooth out. So Jack and the Beanstalk is a metaphor for people who take a dare at a certain point, take an unexpected step that takes them into providence, and then things begin to smooth out. Another level is you can actually talk about how everybody has this. So then Jack becomes not just, like this individual person or that individual person, but like the man, like every man goes through these experiences. And the final level really is the question of union with God. Now, Jack and the Beanstalk isn't normally read on that level, but you can somewhat read it on that level. He steps into a miracle. He goes to his father's house where he receives the inheritance that should have been his, and he's protected unexpectedly, and then he comes back and is able to live a fulfilled life in a full relationship with his mother. It's not a really strong relationship with God, but it is about the spiritual life. You can look at it as being a story about the spiritual life. And that's an important part of a story because we are actually always living on all of those levels. You have your own life that you're living. You have a recognition that you belong to the human race, and a lot of your experiences are common to everybody, but not necessarily all of them. And you're always aware also that you, at least you're always aware of it, that you are searching for God. And every now and then something will happen where you say, oh, yeah, that really speaks to me about the search for God. I want to give you an example that I got from my sister Lucy, just because it's a fun story. We were talking about the universe, and we were talking about the blackness of the sky. And the interesting thing is that there had been a family discussion that the sky is not flat black. Now that you all have color printers, you know the difference between flat black and all the different colors together black. There's just kind of a sparkliness to it or something, a kind of a richness to it. And the night sky has that richness. And when we began to have telescopes where we could just put them on a tripod that was on a timer so we could track the sky, then you can aim at a dark part of the sky and aim at that same part of the sky all night long while the Earth turns, and then end up with a picture of stuff that you can never see in a snapshot. So we have these pictures of galaxies that are billions of light years away. Billions of light years away. And in fact, there's the ultra-deep field is a picture where a pinhole-sized part of the sky was tracked for 16 hours. And they picked the darkest part of the sky where nothing had ever been seen by anybody. And there's this confetti of galaxies. It's just beautiful. Here's the anagogical part of that story. Those galaxies that are 2 billion light years away, what we're seeing is what they looked like 2 billion years ago. So when we look at that picture, we're getting a picture of the universe as it was 2 billion years ago. And now we have the ultra deep field, and we're getting 9 billion years ago. And 9 billion years ago, now we're talking about a very different universe. The universe is only 14 billion years old, and when you go back 9 billion years, it doesn't really look quite the same. So you're actually seeing the past. Here's the thing. In order to see the deepest mysteries of the cosmos, you have to look at the darkest place all night long. Well, that's pretty cool, because that is how we experience our spiritual lives. That these darknesses come, and we need to stay with them. And those who have lived through these deep darknesses have an understanding of the cosmos that is stupendous and so beautiful. So the anagogical level of any story, scientific or literary, is an important level. And for those people who are curious about Cinderella, here's the deal. Everybody knows the story of Cinderella. Her fairy godmother gave her shoes and clothes and everything, and she went to the ball, and when it was time to come home, she left just barely in time, ran as fast as she could, dropped a shoe, and everything turned to rags, except the other shoe. So why didn't the other shoe turn to rags? And here's why. Because the true magic in a love story is love. The fairy godmother, she'd be like our guardian angel. God loves us, he uses a guardian angel, that's fine. But love is what the story is about. And what happened to that shoe was the lover had one shoe. And so the bond with the lover held the other shoe. And both shoes survived. And that's how he found her. I have to read you a story. A little while ago, Jennifer Fulweiler came to talk about her story. She is a convert from atheism. And her father's an incredible, wonderful man, but a complete atheist, and that's how she grew up. And she did know that her grandparents were Catholics. So her mother was raised Catholic. But her own coming into the church had nothing to do with her grandparents, particularly. It was a journey that she took, and it's a fascinating story. And at the end of the story, she's a Catholic, and her husband has come into the church with her, and she's got her third child, and she finds out she's got this rare blood disorder that means that her doctor is on the case about what kind of contraception are you going to use. And she goes, actually, natural family planning. But anyway, so at the very tail end of the book, she has this brief story about getting ready for her son Donald's baptism. Was I really now the Catholic mother with 3 young children, a miraculous medal dangling from my neck, scurrying through the house to prepare for a son's baptism? How did I get here? And she's rummaging through her drawers, trying to find some good clothes for to the baptism. And she pulls the drawer. Oh, here. I yanked open a drawer that I thought might contain my scarves. There were no scarves inside, but instead, a long rectangular box slid to the front. Its white color was faded to a dusty pearl, and so forth. A long object rattled inside. I opened the small flap at the end of the box and slid the contents into my palm. A candle landed in my hand. My baptism candle. She had been baptized at the behest of her grandparents. And so it was kind of like, oh, that was the other shoe. The moment the priest baptized me, I was sealed with the sign of belonging to Christ, an indelible mark on my soul that not even a life as an avowed atheist and unrepentant sinner could wipe away. God and his church were set as my home, and something deep within me would never truly be at peace until I return to it. And she goes on. So it's really a story of how God had this shoe and he came and he found her. It's just beautiful. So that's what I have to say about literature. I know that I haven't given you lists of books, and maybe we can talk about those, but thank you for coming. Does anybody want to ask anything, or should we just...